Before we begin, since this is a BBC-owned property, I feel the need to point out that the news arm of the BBC has a continuing issue with transphobic leanings in its news coverage. You can find in a pinned comment below various videos from both myself and other YouTubers covering this issue. And while I understand that the Doctor Who creative team is not responsible for this, I will continue to point this out for as long as it remains a consistent issue. Thank you. Tag. You're it. The Power of the Doctor. Jodie Whittaker's last episode. The final episode with Chris Chibnall as showrunner. Possibly the last episode he'll ever write. Who knows? But it's an ending of a lot. And I came into this really quite nervous. Because knowing how much we were seeing in the trailers, how much stuff has been left dangling from previous series up to this point, primarily series 12, but also some from 13, or Flux, however you want to think of it. There's a lot of stuff. This is crammed full. This has got 3 villains set up. This has got so many appearances from older characters that are coming back, most of which were not shown in the marketing footage. So, like, it's even more returning people than you think it's gonna be. All of this stuff just kind of crammed into one space. It is jam-packed with crisis on top of crisis on top of bonkers plan from the Master on top of some very cheap tugging at the heartstrings kind of stuff. And you know what? It actually kind of works. I'm stunned right now. And it's really difficult to talk about because this, as an episode, is both a success and a failure. As an episode on its own, I actually think it's very successful. This is pretty good. This reminds me of RTD's finales. This has that kind of, yes, it's a little bit cheesy. Yes, we're just kind of cramming a bunch of stuff in, but if you can hit the right emotional notes along the way, it still lands right, and this does. But at the same time, by the nature of what it chooses to focus on, or kind of more glaringly, all the stuff that it just opts to not deal with, it kind of highlights a lot of the failings of Chibnall's era overall. So, at a certain point, probably about an hour in, when this thing really got its claws into me, that also required me to accept that what Chibnall had opted to do, rather than try and actually dial back and properly deal with a bunch of remaining dangling threads, and when I say dangling threads, I mean stuff like the Timeless Child, that has ultimately not really meant anything. Stuff like Joe Martin, who still has a ton of questions to be answered for, such as why the heck was her TARDIS even a police box? I get why I'm just going to go into spoilers. Realize this. I get why the Masters is a police box. It's a mockery, especially given what his plan is intended to be. But why the heck was hers that? Why did you set up the whole thing with the fob arch that it had answers, dropped it into the TARDIS, and that never comes up again? Are we actually going to expect Davies to pick up on that? Because I wouldn't expect him to. Generally, it's a matter of wiping the slate clean, but there's all this stuff left over. Is Gallifrey destroyed? Is it not? All this stuff that Chibnall just decided to not deal with. And on the one hand, that is kind of emblematic of a failure of his tenure. But at the same time, for the sake of this episode on its own, that was almost definitely the right call. Because if this had tried to actually deal with all the stuff that had been brought up and not properly really addressed or felt like it hadn't gone anywhere yet, then this honestly couldn't have been its own thing. It would have been nothing but going through a checklist of all this stuff that he had intended to do, hoped to do, but couldn't do because of COVID, shortened seasons, possibly being forced out of the position earlier than he wanted. We don't know. That's rumored. I don't want to get into the rumor mill, but like all these circumstances that probably kneecapped his ability to do what he wanted to do during his time, he could either have spent however long they gave him, about an hour and a half, just going through a checklist of trying to tie stuff off, which would have felt dull and mechanical and just like, oh, okay, okay, oh, okay. Or he could throw all that aside, except that he was just flat out not going to be able to give a satisfying answer or conclusion to any of them and just focus on giving us a good episode here. And that is what he did. And you can disagree with that choice. I do think it's the right one under the circumstances. And with that choice in mind, I think he succeeded. It took me a little bit of time to fully get into the mindset of accepting that this wasn't going to deal with huge swaths of stuff. And so much of this, like, especially at this point, the Timeless Child seems pointless. Like, it meant nothing. It went nowhere. That in and of itself does kind of tick me off. Why'd you do it if you weren't going to do anything with it? I'm sure he had something he wanted to do with it. He didn't get the chance to for probably a multitude of reasons. But rather than give us a cheap, lousy, condensed checklist bullet point version of whatever it was he had tried to do originally, he gives us this. And as much as I'm going to remain curious about where he would have wanted to go with stuff like The Timeless Child or a bunch of the dangling questions about Joe Martin or whatever, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'd rather have this than have those answers. So I'm actually feeling pretty good right now. I will say the other thing that I suppose I'll note now up front is that while I do like this episode quite a bit, now I actually think as a finale, it's pretty dang strong. I wish it was the finale of a better run of shows. I wish it was a finale for a better era. But as a finale, I actually think it's pretty good. So taking that into account, I do think that it's worth my noting. It doesn't really alter too many of my feelings about Whittaker in the part overall, partially because due to the nature of the story and what happens with the Master, and I'll get into my thoughts on more of these specifics as I go. Due to how that works, Whittaker doesn't get as much of a highlight as I would have wanted. That is, in some ways, a little bit of the sacrifice of what happens when you bring all this other stuff in. You could actually kind of argue it happened a little bit to Tennant in, I would actually say Journey's End would be a better example. He got a pretty good highlight in, say, The End of Time, but say Journey's End, which was a finale, and I feel like a finale that this is kind of pulling from, spiritually speaking, Tennant himself and the 10th Doctor does kind of get sidelined to make room for everybody else. It was more acceptable there because he'd had a stronger run up to that point, and or at least to me, it was more acceptable there. Whereas here, like, I would have liked to feel like, because I've always kind of felt a little bit at a distance with Whittaker's Doctor, and this doesn't really fix that, but at this point, it probably nothing could. I would have liked to have had more emphasis on her, had her have more focus. But again, to give her that means cutting back or removing a whole bunch of other stuff that I did like. So what do you do? And part of the reason I mentioned this is because I'm going to have coming out in a week, 2 weeks, something like 2 weeks, my new ranking of all the Doctors. And the thing is, I've already shot it because I went in saying, I can't imagine this last episode is going to change my opinion of the Doctor herself. And ultimately, it didn't. So, neither positive nor negative. I feel the same about her now that I did when I shot that video a week and a half or so ago, and when it airs in a little bit from now. So, yeah, kind of got on a tangent. Anyway, let's actually talk about this. I'm going all over the place. All right, let's focus it up. Sorry, there was a lot. Grant me that. There was a lot. So let's start with something like the Master. Dewan's really good in this part. He really is kind of nailing what I feel like John Sim was going for, but didn't work for me, especially in Sim's early appearances. But this kind of manic energy, he manages to bring in a way that feels more focused, and as kind of, antsy and everything as he doesn't feel as cartoonish as Sim did, especially in Series 3. So I actually really like this, that he's able to give that same energy that Sim gave when he first started playing the Master, but is able to sort of shave off the edges of that didn't work for me. So I think he's great in this part, and he has a lot of great little moments. He's got this wonderful little touch of self-loathing that gets tossed in just before he is pulled out of the doctor's body, which, okay, that's a cool idea too. It is one of those things where, like, part of me was like, does that fit the rules? Except I actually think it kind of does, because, like, on the one hand, we know about forced regenerations. We know that a body can be selected. This whole thing went down with the second Doctor. So we know all of that. I did wonder, like, but can he, like, imprint his personality over hers? And I'm willing to accept it, given the specifics of everything he's channeling between the TARDIS and this cyber conversion planet, and him having, it's made very clear that he has assembled the tools to do this, and what he's doing is not easy and not something that, like, could just be done for the heck of it. This is something that he had to pull a lot of resources to pull off. And honestly, that's enough for me that I can roll with it. And it's a pretty terrifying idea. And he's downright intimidating, especially when he's with Yaz and he's basically saying, like, come with me, be my companion. And I love the mashup outfit that he ends up putting on of all the different doctors. Yeah, we'll get to that. I'll try and get to everything. I think I first started to realize something's a little off about this, but in a good way, in terms of what I expect from Chibnall when Dan left as early as he did. Because part of me was left wondering, okay, if you're just not going to have him around, why even bother with this little mini adventure and granting him a goodbye from the TARDIS with the same weight you'd normally give with someone, like when they leave at the end of a series or what have you? Why wouldn't you just open and he's, like, already not there? You can, like, call in and be like, oh, I hope you guys are having fun. I'm, like, doing whatever. Except that this is what Chibnall decided to focus on. He decided to put a focus on the companions, on the people that the Doctor has touched the lives of. So actually giving him a proper send-off, even though he is gone early and for the vast majority of this, does actually feel right. It felt confusing at first, but by the time it's done, I look back on it like, no, actually that does feel kind of right. And that was sort of like my first hint, because after it happened, I was like, okay, why did you even bother? But then I kept thinking back to it as the thing was going along, and I was starting to make that shift into what it was actually doing. Then we've got Tegan and Ace. So first of all, I love how ticked Tegan is at the Doctor, and rightfully so, I'd say. And I love all the layers of complication with Ace being around the Doctor. I love that they put her in that jacket and gave her the bat and gave her the Nitro 9 again. Oh, I love Ace so much. And I like Tegan a fair bit as well. But Ace is, she's so good. And yeah, so let's talk about the use of the previous Doctors. First of all, props to the folks behind this for keeping all that under wraps. I imagine that was probably a heck of a lot more easy to do than the fact that Tennant was going to be resuming the role, because, they had to do exterior shooting for that and people spotted him, cell phone pictures, whatever. And obviously what they have with the older Doctors was all just them, in a room with a green screen. That was easy to keep a lid on, keep minimal crew, and, not have that get out. But boy, when we first saw David Bradley, I'm like, oh, cool. And then Colin Baker, and then Peter Davison, and then Paul McGann, and then Sylvester McCoy. And I was already so excited just to see them. And I thought initially it was just going to be that. I like how they vary and they bicker a little bit. And McGann's like, I don't do robes. And McCoy's just, oh, there's always one. It's the dynamic of the better. Like, you need to realize pretty much all these guys have been doing like Big Finish stuff for a while, and some of them have done it together to some degrees. So like they're really good at just taking these little isolated moments in character and just delivering them, and they can be stitched together in this, and it works really well. And it stuns me that I was caught off guard with the whole little hologram implanty thing that the Doctor does when the Doctor shows up in front of Tegan and then turns into Davison. I should have called that. I should have seen that coming, and I don't know why I didn't. But when it did, and the two of them have their back and forth, where Tegan's all like, you look like you, but different. And Peter Davison's like, I could say the same to you. And just seeing that interaction, I don't even like Peter Davison's Doctor all that much, but I got legitimately choked up seeing that. Especially when he said Braveheart to her, which I knew was coming. I knew that line was coming, and I still was like, And then we get to Ace and the volcano. I'm like, it's gonna be McCoy. It's gonna be Sylvester McCoy. And there he was. And I lost it a little bit. I cried a little bit. Chibnall, what the hell, man? Is it a cheap heartstring tug? Yes. Will it mean as much to people who aren't as invested in classic era and are only really that deep into modern era? I don't know. That's not the perspective I have, but I would imagine probably not. But I also think it was delivered well enough that you can still get what this connection between them was like. And I think it would still work, just not necessarily as well. But tell you what, for me, it worked like gangbusters. It was, it hit me right there. Because like that is one of my favorite Doctor companion pairings is Sylvester McCoy and Ace. Seventh Doctor and Ace, Sophie Aura, they are so good together. And just seeing them, I was going to say in the same space, they're not. He's clearly, CGI'd in, but like, I don't care. It's so good. At least for me it is. And then Joe Martin showing up, and like, again, so many questions we have about the Fugitive Doctor that have not been answered, and we're probably going to have to turn to Big Finish to get answers for. And you can definitely, and I even would say, Chibnall failed in his execution of that idea in the show proper. But you know what? I still had a huge grin on my face when she walked through that door, because she's awesome and she has a great presence. And I see her there and she walks in with that confidence and says, I'm the Doctor. I'm like, yes! I don't care that it is failing to pull together everything that came before. By the time that happened, I had detached from the baggage of this era, because there's a lot of baggage. And if somebody is watching this who couldn't detach from the baggage, or says it's basically like saying shut your brain off to disregard the baggage of the era up to this point, I'm not even going to say you're wrong, but I am going to say that if you can do that, I think you'll find a lot to like here. And there's even a bunch of like little ideas along the way that are really cool and neat, like the idea of a traitor Dalek, because what the Daleks have become is a betrayal of the original mission to preserve the Khaled race. And the fact that that's not, well, like, it is a trick in that the Daleks know he's going to betray them, and they're using that, which is actually a pretty clever plan on their part. The fact that he himself is not tricking them, he's sincere, and that a Dalek arrived at that conclusion on his own, that's interesting. That's a neat thing. Bringing back Ashad, ultimately, like, Ashad, again, in terms of the overall era, was still wasted. He was an amazing, fascinating, aesthetically brilliant character who was killed and really shouldn't have been. And he is brought back here, but it's a clone, so he's really just there for the visual and the aesthetic. But the visual and the aesthetic is also part of what's really strong about him. So, Did that character get used to his max potential in Chibnall's hands? No, he didn't. Was I still happy to see him back? Yeah, I was. I like that you can tell just from her performance alone, not with having to sink a ton of time into it, that Yaz is thrown off by meeting Ace and Tegan and being told they used to travel with the Doctor, because we now know her feelings about the Doctor. So to realize that she could be discarded, that's gonna hit her. And it's not like a totally new idea. That's something that kind of came up with Rose, way back with the 10th Doctor. But at the same time, it would hit her. And they don't dwell on it too much where it feels completely like a rehash. It's acknowledged just through little bits of the performance. So that gets sold well. I like that the Doctor gets called out, well, initially by Yaz, but then by other people as well, for not sharing things, which has been kind of part of my issue with the Doctor, is she is so closed off, it has made her hard to relate to for me. But I like that she gets called out on that, and that gets done well. I like the alien that looks like the little girl, but it's actually this energy being. It's actually a little bit Lovecraftian in terms of how the thing actually looks and how weird it is, and I just like that stuff. Is it super important? No. Is it a little bit of an incidental detail? Sure. Do I care? No, because at this point, I'm really just rolling with this thing. And it has not happened nearly as often as I would like with this era of the Doctor. But there has reliably been at least one episode that I was able to key in really well and be like, wow, do I wish there was more of this. Series 11, it was Take Me Away. Series 12, it was Can You Hear Me? Flux, it was War of the Sontarans. And with these last few specials, I did really like Eve of the Daleks, but it's this. I was able to key into exactly what this was doing. Not immediately, as I said, but by a little after the halfway mark, I was keying into it. And by an hour in, I was fully there. And it really just felt good. I always say, I want to love Doctor Who. Every time I watch anything Doctor Who related, new, classic, Big Finish, anything, I want to love it. I can't completely shut off my critical brain. It's kind of why I went off at the beginning at how this fails to deal with all this lingering stuff. I can't completely shut that off, but I can, under the right circumstances, at least put less importance and less emphasis on it and recognize, you know what? This time, I don't need to dwell on that. Now, I'll give you a heads up. That kind of feeling has a tendency to result in something that I enjoy in the moment, but don't think as well on later. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen here. I don't know. But this is the kind of piece of entertainment that can sometimes happen for me with. I have slightly better hopes for this specific thing, though, because as I said, this really does feel like Chibnall made the very deliberate choice. We're not dealing with all the stuff that I have set up and that I couldn't get to. We are giving a celebratory, large-scale story. Tons of former companions. A really bold idea from the Doctor, which is just kind of a more focused take in a way on his whole master race thing from the end of time, which I know a lot of people really hate and I don't. So I'm totally good with that. The performances are good. It looks good. I feel like the music got some better highlights here than it often does. The music of this era overall is underrated, partly because it's usually used as ambience and background, and it's not bombastic the way that Murray Gold was, but that doesn't make it not good, and I feel like I got some better highlights for it here. And then just the sheer number of people that seeing just made me go, oh, I mentioned all the Doctors, obviously Tegan, obviously Ace, but then Mel, who I don't even like. Joe. Ian. This is reminding me of what I liked about Russell's finales. Not always necessarily the regeneration stories, but his finales in general. it's a fireworks display that is also trying to hit you in the feels at least a little bit. And sometimes that can be insufficient. But if it can get it, that works for me. And this actually, shockingly, surprisingly, at the very, very end of a run of Doctor Who that I have had so many issues with, yeah, this worked for me. And then, of course, I can't not bring up the very end where the Doctor not only regenerates into Tennant, but like the clothing gets replaced, which is weird. That's new. Not necessarily something I expect to get addressed, but maybe because we're already dealing clearly with a very anomalous regeneration. I did call both of the lines that Tennant was going to have, starting with, I know these teeth. And then, of course, what? I knew that was going to be it. And knowing it didn't make me smile any less as it happened. I do think they need to be very careful with this. And I think I've said in the past that I think is a terrible idea to have the Doctor regenerate into a former face. I've gone on record with that. They have now done that. I will say that there is one caveat that I didn't take into account that is currently in place that makes me still nervous about this, but certainly much more okay with it than I would have been on premise, which is that we know this is for a short run because we already know who the next Doctor is after this. And so being so upfront that this is limited, short time, anomalous, while I still don't love that egg getting cracked of this idea of like, well, we've established we can do it. I mean, technically they established that they could do it back in Day of the Doctor with the great curator and bring back Tom Baker and just saying you'll revisit some of the old favorites. So like it's already been established, but now they've actually done it as a thing for the Doctor for however many specials we end up getting. I now strongly suspect that we'll get more than just the 60th, but even if that's all we get, like this is short time. And that's a decent way to do it, even though I don't love that seal's broken. Whether or not it was worth it will depend on what happens. So we'll deal with that when we get there. That's also a great sign-off line from Jodie Whittaker. I started with it. Tag, you're it. That's great. I like that she didn't have to give a speech, actually. I like that she just took a quiet moment with Yaz, with ice cream, and looking down on the earth before saying, I'd rather be alone for this. I like that she went low key because it honestly would have been weird for this particular incarnation of the Doctor to do a speech on the level or in the vein of something like what the 11th Doctor did or what the 12th Doctor did before regenerating. Short, simple, little bit of a speech, but just way more low-key about the whole thing. It fits. It works. It is a great button on a very tumultuous era. Like I said, if the rest of Chibnall's run had not been the rest of Chibnall's run, this could have been an amazing final episode on a great era. But since we haven't had a great era, it stands out as an anomalously good final episode. And if I'm very lucky, I'll get this review out same day, at least same day my time, because people are already hounding me like we want to hear your opinion. Maybe it'll end up getting up tomorrow morning. I don't know. We'll see how quickly I can get this finished and rendered and everything. But I think there's probably specific stuff that I am glossing over, missed, didn't think to say, but just I feel good. I'm feeling a way that I wish I felt more during this era, during this run. Power of the Doctor, what did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon is what pays the bills around here. We've had a jump of folks showing up as subscribers lately. Greatly appreciated. We broke 60,000. Hey, that's awesome. If you do want to support my ability to keep doing that, Patreon's the best way to do it. But even if you can't do that, like, share, subscribe, they help me out as well. And what I really want you to remember is that you are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. All right, time to thank my highest supporting patrons. Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Leotha Boyd, Toy Loli, Becky Sparks, Fernobulax, The Poodle, Zach, Bookworm, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Shayla Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. Thank you for your support. If you want to hear me try and say your name while this little guy tries to chew on my earrings, well, you can check out the Patreon for the support tiers that get you a shout out. Thanks so much. You are a pain in my butt.